Hi gardening friends, it's time for an update on our pollinator bed that we're working on this year, and a couple of new things going on. I got my National Wildlife Federation certified habitat signs. Now I've actually been a certified wildlife habitat my property since October of 1999. But I just decided to get some signs this summer. I wanted one for back here for this new garden. And I got a couple of the signs that you can mount on poles for the front of my yard. I live on a corner, so two streets, so a lot of people drive by and some of the neighbors walk by. And I thought it might be good to have the signs up because they probably wonder sometimes what the heck I'm doing. So here is a native grass, which I haven't talked about previously. This borders this bed. This is northern sea oats. And you can see the seed heads are starting to form. They will turn a nice bronzy color. And originally they were the border for this actually bed down here, which is not all native plants. It's part of my shade garden, but there are a few native plants in here. There's a small bottle brush buckeye in the back that I'm hoping will get going. And then I did put in some golden Alexanders for spring. This is also supposed to be a host plant for some of the swallowtails. I didn't see any caterpillars on it this year, but I've had adults in the garden. Painter's palette is Persicaria Virginiana, but it's a cultivar of it that is variegated, has a red flower on it, and it does seed around. Now, it's not really a pollinator plant, but it is native. I do have cup flower in here, which is an interesting plant, and it gets its name from the fact that where the leaves join the stem, rain will sit in there and make a little water cup for insects and birds. So I thought I'd also talk about what turned into kind of a wildflower hedge. I bought some native asters earlier this year, and I've put them in here with some blue switchgrass that I put in last year. And then I had some of the native nodding onions that I put in as a bulb last fall, so they are blooming. And then the yellow is one of the Onotheria that just seeds up around my yard. This is an annual Fleabane, which has been very prolific this year. And I love the brown-eyed Susans. This is Rudbeckia triloba. It wanders around my yard and seeds where it's happy. So what I'm going to do this fall is when we actually get some seed from this, I'm going to cut a couple of stalks and take them over to the other bed and see if I can get them established in that pollinator bed. So this just kind of turned into its own giant pollinator hedge. Some might think it's a weed bed, but it's not. This is a goldenrod. We have pokeweed, which is native. The berries are much loved by bluebirds and cedar waxwings. So I'll have a nice variety for them to eat. There's Joe Pye weed, which if you saw my plant spotlight, I talked about Joe Pye weed, and there's some And both of these plants, which are actually the reason why I have this hedge here, is because they seeded themselves on the edge of this garden. And I didn't want to mow them down, and I never got around to moving them. So all of a sudden I have this, we'll call it a wildflower hedge. But I think it's kind of cool. And the bed behind it was originally, my plan was to make that also a pollinator bed. So some garden phlox is in there, my ironweed, you can see coneflower, oak leaf hydrangeas in there, there's some 9-bark. So trying to make this all pollinator and native insect habitat. And that brings me out to my backyard. So I do let the backyard kind of go wild. I do mow, so I've got an area that I can walk. But this is goldenrod. Do some honeysuckle and some other weeds that I do need to get rid of, get them out of there. But the annual fleabane. The thistles, actually the goldfinches like the thistle. They use it for nesting and for feeding the young, and they nest late. So this isn't for everybody, I realize that, but I wanted to show you that this garden that I've been talking about is just part of what I call my habitat garden. This is in the back of my yard, so it's not in the public eye, because for some I'm sure it looks messy. Well, sedums aren't native, but this sedum planting is doing quite well, and they will bloom in a couple of weeks, it looks like. And pollinators do like sedums. Oh, this is fun, but these little wild petunias that I put in for a ground cover have been blooming, and they seem to be settling in nicely. These are seedlings of the Sea Oats that I'm going to share with a friend who is interested in some. The 9-bark is settling in pretty well. I did, since our last video, I did get in here and do some hand weeding. So part of establishing, even if you're trying to do a meadow, the first year or two, it's important to keep the weeds under control so your plants that you want get established. Butterfly weed. All right, we're gonna have to take a closer look at him. He's got some stippling on him. I wonder if he's got aphids or spider mites. I'm gonna have to check that out. Yellow stippling on the leaves is not usually a good sign. And it has been good weather for spider mites. They like it hot and dry. The clover has been doing okay since the last rain, and some of the asters that I planted earlier this spring are doing fine. I've got ferns underneath here that are doing pretty well. I will probably cut back the forsythia and the grapevines in the fall. I would like to see the ferns, but I don't want to fry them now if I cut things back. So the grapevines get out of control. That's been one of the problems back here. The birds leave them for me, and then you have to deal with them. This is I think it's peach-leafed ironweed. No, narrow-leaf, sorry. Narrow-leaf ironweed that I planted at the end of June. So it looks like it's gonna bloom this year, which is exciting. Another ironweed. The Calicanthus is throwing a few more occasional blooms. Oh, now this is, we talked about painter's palette. This is the native Persicaria Virginiana. And I don't know where it showed up from. I did find some other plants on another part of the property. This can actually, from what I've read about it, after I identified it, can be rather aggressive in a garden situation, and it will self-sow. It's actually called jump seed because when these set seed, they kind of explode and find a way to move away from the mother plant. So I could end up with quite a planting of this if I leave it here. I haven't decided yet. I don't know that I want it in this bed, and from what I read, it could get rather well established. The 9-bark, it's been dry again this week, warm and dry. I've watered it twice this week. It was starting to get a little wilty. The Culver's root is still blooming a little bit. The purple one is done. I did not weed this yet. So here we have the garlic mustard, my nemesis. These will be ready. This is, if I leave them, which I'm not going to, this is what will bloom next year. Remember, they're a biennial. Pokeweed blooms the first year, even though it's perennial. It's ready to bloom, and it's probably got a taproot on it. So we need to clean this spot out. And I may wait to do that till my bulbs come, because I'm planning on putting some native bulbs in here. Oh, sad news on the Aralia. It died. I did a little investigating, and I found a cutworm in the crown of the plant, and it had chewed it right down to nothing. So I kind of dug up the root ball, and the roots still looked healthy. And some plants you can propagate through root cuttings. So I kind of buried the root pieces back in, but unfortunately something dug it up, and I don't know if they're going to make it or if any of the pieces will root. I'm going to leave the cage here for next spring and see if anything comes up. Otherwise, we'll try something else. But if you remember, I was thinking this wasn't the best spot. It was probably too sunny for an Aralia. So we'll try that plant again next year. It's a big plant, so it needs more room. So it may go in the back where there's more shade and some room. So as I said, it's been a dry, warm week again. I did some 911 watering this morning. Things look a little better, except for that amaranth is still rather wilty. When you find plants that are wilted, you do want to water them regardless of the time of day. You don't want them to get to a point where they can't return from. And I did do some weeding in here, so the plants that I'm trying to establish get enough sun, they get enough water. The clover was doing well, and it looks like the woodchuck or the rabbits came in and did some shearing on it. So that's one downside of the clover, is that animals like to eat it, but they also sheared that bed down and it's grown back. So it's a perennial, so I think that's okay. But we'll see if that brings animals into the garden and maybe causes other problems. So this is all my, experiment to see how to keep the garlic mustard from invading and yet get other plants established. And I like having the living ground cover rather than mulching everything. Sometimes rain, if you just get a light shower, it doesn't get down through the mulch. But I think it would get down through the clover. Our Canadian goldenrod is starting to color up now, so we'll have a nice... This was here on its own. I have a lot of Canadian goldenrod in the backyard. Still not sure what that goldenrod is. My plant app wouldn't ID it for me. I did put some stakes up on some of these plants. They were getting droopy. This is my showy tick trefoil. So this is getting ready to bloom. This is going to be a pretty plant, and the pollinators will like it. And there's a bunch of smaller stalks down here. And the flat top asters are starting to bloom. And they really are flat on top. They're very cool. So pollinators usually love asters. And these are probably about 4 feet tall. These are some more that haven't started to bloom yet. Oh, back here is our Allegheny Monkey flower, which does not have blooms on it yet. And then this, one of the common names of this plant is yellow ironweed, even though it's not in the same species. It got that common name because it's got similar characteristics to ironweed. They bloom at similar times. It's tall. It also likes moist soils as ironweed do, and the tough stem and the leaf shape. But it's actually a plant called wing stem, and I'm not sure why. I'm going to have to look into that. But this will be yellow. It'll have yellow flowers. You can start to see a little bit of color there. Oh, the showy phlox that I bought. This is an interesting one because it has such small flowers on it compared to some of the hybrid phloxes that I have. And then my swamp milkweed that I put in last year hasn't done great. It's survived. I don't know if it's just been the hot, dry summer. I have watered it, but it did send up new growth, and it is growing. It has not flowered, so we'll see what happens with that. And then our American mountain mint, got another one starting to bloom here. That one's just about done. This will be showy goldenrod. Yep. So things are progressing. It is mid-August in the garden, and we'll check in again in a month. One thing I was going to talk about is this amaranth. So I bought these as a 6-pack in the spring, and they just ended up in this bed because where I was going to put them, I didn't have room. But this just shows you the variety of what can happen when you collect seed. So I'm assuming that these are maybe an heirloom or open pollinated, meaning that they will pollinate each other. They're not a hybrid, I don't think. I don't have the name of them. This is kind of interesting because these are the flowers here. So amaranth, weed that is related to these is pigweed, which you may have in your garden. But I love this one. I love the leaf color on this one. I mean, it is scarlet. And that's what I was hoping they would all be. So if I was going to be saving and collecting seed, this would be the one I would want to collect from and plant next year. So you would collect those seeds, plant them, and hope that you get more of these instead of these. These guys are pretty, but this one's crazy. And sometimes amaranths will self-sow in the garden. So some of them may just come back on their own. It's kind of a nice feature of some of the annuals if they self-sow. Oh, and yep, that does seem to be part of the aromatic asters. I've got 3 aromatic asters. All right. So I've got some more work cut out for me to do in here. I want to do some more clearing this fall, especially over in this area with the garlic mustard and some of these grapevines. I'd like to extend the bed into this end. And then there is goldenrod out there on its own. And then my camisea is over in this area. I've got another nice giant pokeweed here. You can see the seed heads of the Camassia. Got some wild bramble in here. A black walnut that's got to come out. So fall is a good time to get rid of some of these weeds so that you can plant next spring. And I think I'll do what I did over here. So once we get the ground clear and we get some cool weather again and some regular moisture, we'll seed the ground with the clover. That worked pretty well for this bed last spring. I didn't have a lot of weeding to do, and I haven't had to do much weeding. You can see the occasional garlic mustard, but there's only a few and not hundreds. So I think we will try that again. All right, well, signing off till next month.